The chandeliers of Westbrook Hall cast uncertain light across the assembled guests on the evening of April the 12th, 1818, their candle flames wavering as a spring storm gathered beyond the tall windows. And Eleanor Pembroke stood at the periphery of the charitable assembly, in a gown the colour of fading lavender, not quite mourning and not quite fashionable, much like herself at 29 years of age. She had come only because her sister Margaret had insisted with such pretty pleading that refusal seemed churlish, though Eleanor knew herself to be an ornament no ballroom required. Too thin where fashion demanded curves, too pale where rosiness was prized. Her hair an indeterminate brown that caught no light. Her features composed of adequate parts that somehow failed to charm when arranged together upon her face. She had made peace with invisibility over the long years of her spinsterhood, had learned to move through society like a benevolent ghost, present enough to satisfy propriety, but expecting nothing of notice, nothing of significance. The assembly hummed with conversation and the distant strains of musicians tuning their instruments, and Eleanor occupied herself with studying the architectural mouldings along the ceiling, a habit born of having nowhere else to direct her gaze, when she became aware of her own name spoken in the cluster of gentlemen near the refreshment table. Lord Christopher Thornhill stood among them, his tall frame elegant in black evening clothes, his dark hair silvered at the temples in a way that somehow enhanced rather than diminished his handsomeness. And his expression was one of cool amusement as another gentleman gestured in Eleanor's direction. She should have moved away, should have granted them privacy, but some paralysis held her still as Lord Thornhill's voice carried across the diminishing space between them, clear and measured and utterly without warmth. Could he entertain interest in Miss Pembroke? Someone had asked, and his reply fell upon Eleanor like cold rain through rotted silk. He could never, he said, love someone so plain, so thoroughly unremarkable, so entirely without the qualities that might recommend a woman to a man of sense and position. His words were deliberate, each one chosen and placed with precision, and Eleanor felt them lodge beneath her ribs even as she maintained the composed expression years of dismissal had trained her to wear. What startled her, what she could not reconcile even as humiliation spread through her chest, was the look upon his face as he spoke, a tightness around his eyes that seemed almost like pain, a tension in his jaw that contradicted the casual cruelty of his words. Through the window behind him, she could see his carriage waiting in the courtyard below, black lacquered wood bearing the Thornhill crest in gold. And as the first drops of rain began to strike the glass, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity that she had been a fool to come tonight, a fool to imagine even for a moment that her presence anywhere might matter to anyone at all. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Eleanor remained in her position near the wall for half an hour after Lord Thornhill's words had found their mark, her hands folded before her with a composure that cost her more than anyone watching could have guessed, and she told herself that she had endured worse dismissals over the years, though she could not at that moment recall when or where. The rain intensified beyond the windows, drops striking the glass with increasing violence, as if nature herself protested the cruelty that had unfolded within, and Eleanor became gradually aware that Margaret had detached herself from a cluster of young matrons and was moving toward her with concern written plainly across her pretty features. Her sister wore rose silk that complemented her fashionable figure and brought color to her cheeks, everything that Eleanor's lavender gown failed to accomplish, and Margaret's hand upon her arm was gentle as she leaned close to whisper that Eleanor looked unwell, that perhaps they should leave early. The kindness nearly undid her, nearly cracked the careful mask she wore, but Eleanor managed to nod and murmur something about a headache, about the changing weather, about anything except the truth that burned like acid in her chest. As they made their way toward the entrance hall, Eleanor heard the whispers that trailed behind them like the train of a gown, voices that thought themselves discreet but carried perfectly well to her ears. Lady Harriet Sinclair's distinctive laugh rang out from near the refreshment table, and Eleanor caught fragments of delighted gossip about Lord Thornhill's pronouncement, about poor Miss Pembroke's unfortunate situation, about how the entire exchange had been witnessed by at least a dozen guests who would ensure the story travelled through every drawing-room in London by week's end. Eleanor forced herself to walk steadily, to keep her chin level and her expression serene, to give them nothing more to discuss than they already possessed, though her lavender gown felt suddenly like a banner of defeat, advertising her in-between state to everyone she passed. Margaret requested their cloaks with unusual urgency, and as they waited in the entrance hall, Eleanor glanced back through the doorway toward the ballroom and saw Lord Thornhill standing apart from his companions now, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that seemed utterly at odds with the casual dismissal he had spoken. His jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid beneath his elegant evening coat, and for a moment their gazes locked across the crowded space with such force that Eleanor forgot to breathe. Then Lady Harriet moved deliberately into his line of sight, her peacock blue gown shimmering as she touched his arm with possessive familiarity. And the connection broke as Christopher turned toward the society matron with what appeared to be resignation. Eleanor accepted her cloak from the servant, let Margaret guide her down the steps into the rain-swept night, and tried not to wonder why a man who found her so thoroughly unremarkable had looked at her just now as though she were the only person in the room, or why his black, lacquered carriage with its gold Thornhill crest remained in the courtyard long after they departed, visible through the rain like a dark sentinel keeping watch over something he had claimed not to want. The hired carriage moved through London streets slick with rain, and Eleanor sat beside Margaret in silence as the city lights blurred through the water streaming down the windows, each passing street lamp a smear of gold against the darkness that seemed to have seeped inside her chest and taken up permanent residence. Margaret attempted conversation twice, gentle inquiries about whether Eleanor wished to discuss what had happened, but the questions died in the face of Eleanor's careful composure, and eventually her sister simply took her hand and held it, a small warmth against the chill that had nothing to do with the spring storm. They arrived at Eleanor's townhouse near midnight. The modest building tucked into a respectable, if unfashionable, street where widows and spinsters of reduced circumstances maintained their dignity in narrow homes with peeling paint and servants they could barely afford to keep. Margaret insisted on accompanying her inside despite the late hour, and Sarah met them in the entrance hall with a wrapper pulled over her nightclothes and concern written across her plain features as she took in Eleanor's pale face and the careful blankness of her expression. Eleanor assured both her sister and her maid that she was perfectly well, merely tired, merely affected by the weather, and she climbed the narrow stairs to her bedchamber with legs that felt as though they belonged to someone else entirely. Sarah followed to help her undress, nimble fingers working the buttons of the lavender gown that Eleanor now despised with an intensity that surprised her, each fastening releasing her from fabric that had become a shroud of humiliation. Her maid said nothing as she hung the dress in the wardrobe and helped Eleanor into her nightgown, but her movements were gentle, protective, and when she brushed out Eleanor's unremarkable brown hair, her touch was tender enough that Eleanor had to close her eyes against the sting of tears she refused to shed. Sarah departed with a whispered good-night and instructions that Eleanor should ring if she needed anything at all, and then Eleanor was alone in the small room that overlooked the street, alone with the sound of rain against glass and the hollow ache of words that kept repeating in her mind with the rhythm of a funeral march. Plain, he had said. Unremarkable. Entirely without qualities that might recommend her. She moved to the window and pulled back the curtain, needing to see something beyond the confines of her humiliation, and there below in the street stood a black lacquered carriage bearing a gold crest, she recognized even through the rain and darkness. Its lamps still lit like watchful eyes, its horses standing patient beneath the downpour, and inside she could just make out the shadow of a figure who sat motionless, as though keeping vigil over something precious rather than something he had named worthless only hours before. Eleanor woke to grey dawn light filtering through her curtains after a night spent watching shadows move across her ceiling, while rain drummed its relentless rhythm against the glass. And her first coherent thought was that she must have imagined the carriage below, because surely no one would remain stationed in such weather through all the dark hours, simply to torment someone they had publicly dismissed as unremarkable. She rose despite exhaustion that weighted her limbs like iron, wrapped herself in her dressing gown against the morning chill, and moved to the window with the careful steps of someone approaching the scene of an accident, half dreading and half needing to see what remained of last night's humiliation. The carriage stood exactly where she had last seen it, black lacquer gleaming wet in the early light, the Thornhill crest catching what little illumination the overcast sky provided, and the horses had been changed at some point during the night, which meant someone had brought fresh animals and taken away the tired ones, which meant this was not abandonment or coincidence, but deliberate, ongoing presence. Eleanor pressed her hand to the cold glass and tried to make sense of a situation that defied every understanding she possessed of human behavior, because why would a man who found her entirely without recommendable qualities station himself outside her home like a sentry guarding treasure he had declared worthless? She dressed in her simple grey morning gown with Sarah's help, the maid's silence more eloquent than questions would have been, and descended to the morning room where weak sunlight struggled through windows that also overlooked the street and offered another vantage point from which to observe the inexplicable vigil continuing below. Mrs. Davies brought tea and toast that Eleanor could not imagine eating, though she went through the motions of lifting cup to lips because routine was all that stood between her and complete dissolution, and she had just managed to swallow a mouthful of tea gone cold when Sarah announced that Mrs. Margaret Hartley had called, despite the early hour and the impropriety of visiting before 10 in the morning. Margaret swept in wearing a fashionable yellow day dress that made her look like captured sunshine, all golden warmth and vibrant life, everything Eleanor had never been. And her sister's face held an expression that mingled concern with something that looked oddly like suppressed excitement as she dismissed Sarah and closed the door to ensure their privacy. The gossip had spread faster than Margaret had anticipated, she explained, as she settled beside Eleanor on the worn settee, and by the time Margaret had returned home last night, her husband had already heard 3 separate accounts of Lord Thornhill's public dismissal of poor Miss Pembroke at the Westbrook Assembly, each version more elaborate than the last, and Lady Harriet Sinclair had apparently spent the entire evening ensuring that every person of consequence knew exactly what his lordship thought of Eleanor's prospects. Margaret's hand found Eleanor's and squeezed with a fierceness that surprised them both. And she revealed that Lady Beatrice Ashford's mother had been present and had looked triumphant throughout the gossip's circulation, which suggested the entire scene had been orchestrated to remove Eleanor as even a peripheral possibility in the marriage market, not that Eleanor had ever been a genuine contender for a man so far above her station. Eleanor listened to her sister's recitation with the curious detachment of someone hearing about events that had happened to a stranger, and only when Margaret finally paused for breath did Eleanor gesture toward the window and ask in a voice she barely recognized as her own whether Margaret noticed anything unusual about the street outside. April 14th arrived with weather so improved from the previous day's storms that Eleanor could almost believe the grey dampness had been a fever dream rather than reality, and the afternoon sun slanted through her windows with a warmth that felt like false promise as she prepared to venture out for the market errands she could no longer defer simply because a mysterious carriage had taken up residence outside her home like an unwanted monument to her humiliation. Sarah accompanied her with the shopping basket and a protective hovering that Eleanor found both touching and suffocating. And when they descended the front steps into the bright spring afternoon, Eleanor kept her gaze fixed determinedly ahead rather than allowing her eyes to drift toward the black, lacquered presence that had haunted her peripheral vision for 2 full days. She wore her dark blue walking dress because it was her second best, and the day seemed to demand something less funereal than the grey she had hidden in yesterday, and her bonnet provided blessed cover for her face as they walked along the narrow street toward the main thoroughfare, where merchants sold vegetables and fabric and all the ordinary things that comprised a life lived in modest respectability. They would have to pass directly beside the carriage, Eleanor realized with a sinking sensation in her stomach, because there was no other route unless she wished to take an absurd detour through the mews, and she straightened her spine with the same determination that had carried her through 29 years of being unremarkable, and began walking with steps that she willed to appear confident, despite the trembling that had taken up residence in her knees. The carriage loomed larger as they approached, its gold Thornhill crest catching the sunlight like an accusation, and Eleanor was perhaps 10 feet away when the door opened, and Lord Christopher Thornhill himself stepped down onto the street with movements that suggested he had been watching her approach and had timed his emergence with precision that felt either calculated or desperate. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds that stretched into something infinite, and Eleanor saw what she had not allowed herself to see at the assembly, or in any of her fevered recollections since, which was that his face bore the marks of sleeplessness that matched her own, shadows beneath eyes that were not cold at all, but rather burned with an intensity that contradicted every word he had spoken about her unremarkable qualities. His expression held something that looked remarkably like anguish, and his hand lifted as though he might speak or reach toward her, or somehow bridge the impossible distance between what he had said and what his continued presence outside her home might mean. But Eleanor could not bear whatever words might come from lips that had already delivered such devastating pronouncements, and she dropped her gaze and hurried past with Sarah scurrying to keep pace, her heart hammering against her ribs with a violence that suggested something more complex than simple humiliation had taken root in her chest during the long hours of watching his vigil from her window. April 16th arrived with morning light that seemed too cheerful for Eleanor's state of mind, and she sat in her morning room with tea growing cold in its cup, while her eyes kept drifting toward the window where the black carriage remained in its now customary position, a fixture as permanent as the lamp-post beside it, and considerably more disturbing to her fragile equilibrium. Sarah announced Mr. Thomas Langley with an inflection that suggested relief at the arrival of someone sensible and protective, and Eleanor rose to greet her late father's former business partner with genuine warmth, because Thomas had been one of the few constants in the years since her father's death had reduced their circumstances from comfortable to merely respectable. Thomas entered with his characteristic diffident kindness, his greying hair and gentle manner making him seem older than his 45 years, and he accepted tea with hands that seemed unusually restless as he settled into the chair opposite Eleanor, and spent several minutes discussing inconsequential matters in a way that suggested he was building courage for a more difficult conversation. Eleanor waited with the patience she had learned from years of being overlooked. And finally, Thomas set down his cup with enough force to make the porcelain ring against the saucer, and asked with uncharacteristic bluntness whether she was aware that Lord Christopher Thornhill had stationed himself outside her home for 4 consecutive days. The carriage was visible through the very window beside them, Eleanor pointed out with a calmness she did not feel. So yes, she had noticed the phenomenon, though she could not begin to explain it, and something in her tone must have revealed more vulnerability than she intended, because Thomas's expression shifted from concern to something closer to alarm. He had made inquiries, Thomas explained with obvious reluctance, because he considered himself responsible for Eleanor's welfare in the absence of her father, and what he had learned about Lord Thornhill's character was not reassuring for a woman in Eleanor's position. Christopher Thornhill was known throughout London as a man of cold calculation. Thomas revealed, someone who approached every decision, including matrimonial prospects, with the strategic precision of a military campaign, and there were rumors that he had courted and discarded 3 young women in the past 2 years once he determined they would not advance his social position sufficiently. Thomas leaned forward with an earnestness that made Eleanor's chest tighten with apprehension, and he suggested with obvious discomfort that the carriage's presence outside her home might not indicate admiration or interest, but rather something far more cruel. Perhaps a deliberate attempt to damage her reputation so thoroughly that no other gentleman would consider courting her, thus eliminating even peripheral competition in a marriage market where Lord Thornhill was expected to make a brilliant match with someone like Lady Beatrice Ashford. The words landed on Eleanor like physical blows, and she felt something inside her chest that she had not known was taking root suddenly wither and die, because she had allowed herself over the past days to wonder if perhaps the contradiction between Christopher's harsh words and his persistent presence might mean something other than cruelty, and Thomas's explanation fit the facts with a terrible logic that made her foolish hope seem like the delusion it undoubtedly was. Thomas departed 20 minutes later with promises to call again soon and a final warning to avoid any direct interaction with Lord Thornhill. And Eleanor sat alone in her morning room, watching the carriage through the window while tears she refused to shed burned behind her eyes, and the truth settled into her bones with the weight of stones. April 18th arrived with evening twilight painting the London sky in shades of amber and violet, and Eleanor stood at her bedroom window watching the black carriage that had become as permanent a fixture on her street as the gas lamps. Her hands trembling with an anger that had been building for 2 days since Thomas Langley's visit, had poisoned even the small, confused hope she had not known she was harboring in the secret chambers of her foolish heart. She had spent 6 days watching that carriage. 6 days of confusion and wounded pride, and a dawning wonder that perhaps his presence meant something other than the cruel dismissal his words at the assembly had delivered. But Thomas's explanation fit with a logic so terrible and so complete that Eleanor felt humiliated by her own capacity for self-deception, and the anger that rose in her chest was directed as much at herself as at the man who sat in that carriage, apparently determined to ruin what little reputation a plain spinster of 29 might possess. The anger propelled her down the stairs before caution or propriety could intervene, and she threw her evening shawl over the simple day dress she still wore without bothering to change into anything more suitable, and Sarah called after her with alarm as Eleanor pushed through the front door into the soft spring evening and marched across the narrow street with her chin lifted and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The carriage door was closed, but she could see his silhouette through the window, and she knocked on the polished wood with more force than was ladylike, and there was a moment of stillness before the door opened and Lord Christopher Thornhill looked down at her with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to something that might have been relief or dread, or both tangled together. Eleanor did not wait for him to speak or to hand her up into the carriage, but simply demanded with a voice that shook despite her best efforts to know why he was tormenting her. What purpose this vigil outside her home could possibly serve, except to destroy her through association with a scandal of his making, and she told him that she understood now that his strategy was to ruin her so thoroughly that no other man would ever consider her, thus eliminating even the most peripheral competition in a marriage market where he was expected to make a brilliant match. Christopher's face went through a series of changes as she spoke, and he extended his hand as though to help her into the carriage so they might speak more privately. and Eleanor found herself accepting that hand and climbing into the intimate leather-scented space that smelled of him, sandalwood, and something darker, and the door closed behind her, leaving them alone in the dimness, with only the fading evening light filtering through the windows. He looked as though she had struck him, and his mouth opened and closed twice before he managed to ask, in a voice rougher than she had heard from him, whether she truly believed him capable of such calculated cruelty. And Eleanor steeled herself against the hurt in his eyes, because she had been hurt first and more publicly, and she would not be manipulated by a man who had already declared her unworthy of love. She told him she did not know what to believe, except that his words at the assembly had been clear enough, and his presence here was destroying what little peace she had managed to construct from the ruins of her dignity. And she demanded that he leave her street and her life and allow her to disappear back into the invisibility that had been her portion before he had made her the subject of gossip and speculation. Christopher leaned forward, and for a moment she thought he might take her hands, or touch her face, or do something that would shatter her defenses entirely, but instead he pulled back, and his expression shuttered into something cold and remote. And he said with a formality that felt like another rejection that he had never claimed to love her, and she should not imagine what was not there. And Eleanor felt those words land like blows, even though they were merely echoes of what he had already said. And she fled the carriage with her eyes burning and her throat tight, aware that neighbors were watching from windows, and that she had just made everything infinitely worse. April 20th arrived with afternoon light that carried the warmth of advancing spring, and Eleanor sat in her drawing room, attempting to focus on needlework that her trembling hands rendered nearly impossible while her mind replayed the scene in the carriage 2 days prior, the way Christopher's face had shuttered when he told her not to imagine what was not there, words that should have provided clarity but instead left her more confused because the carriage remained outside her window like a silent accusation or perhaps a promise she was too foolish to interpret correctly. Sarah announced Lady Harriet Sinclair with a tone that suggested the maid recognized a predator entering their modest sanctuary, and Eleanor rose with the ingrained politeness that years of social invisibility had taught her. Watching as Lady Harriet swept into the room in an elaborate afternoon costume of peacock blue silk that probably cost more than Eleanor's household expenses for 6 months, the older woman's sharp eyes cataloguing every worn corner and faded curtain with the precision of someone inventorying evidence of reduced circumstances. Eleanor offered tea with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will, and Lady Harriet accepted with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, settling into the best chair as though conferring a favor by her presence, and she spent several minutes discussing trivial social matters in a way that made Eleanor's nerves stretch tighter, because she knew this visit had a purpose beyond pleasantries. Lady Harriet's gaze drifted to the window where the black carriage was clearly visible in its customary position, and she remarked with false sympathy how distressing it must be for Eleanor to find herself the subject of such particular attention from a gentleman so far above her station, especially when everyone knew that Lord Christopher Thornhill was under considerable pressure from his family to make a brilliant match with someone like Lady Beatrice Ashford, a young woman of impeccable breeding and substantial fortune, who would be a credit to the Thornhill name. Eleanor's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer, and Lady Harriet continued with the relentless courtesy of someone delivering poison wrapped in silk, suggesting that Eleanor might not have considered why a man of Christopher's calculating nature would station himself outside the home of a woman he had publicly declared unworthy of his affection, and she proposed with devastating logic that perhaps his strategy was to so thoroughly associate Eleanor with scandal and speculation that no other gentleman would ever consider courting her, thus eliminating even the most peripheral competition in a marriage market where every unattached woman represented a potential complication to his planned alliance with Lady Beatrice. The words landed on Eleanor with the force of confirmation rather than revelation, because Thomas Langley had planted similar suspicions, but hearing them spoken aloud by someone of Lady Harriet's social standing gave them a weight that made Eleanor's chest constrict with humiliation and hurt, and she found herself nodding with numb acceptance as Lady Harriet painted a picture of deliberate cruelty disguised as interest. A man so determined to control every variable in his matrimonial calculations that he would destroy a spinster's reputation simply to ensure she remained safely invisible and unattached. Lady Harriet departed 30 minutes later with expressions of concern that felt like victory, and Eleanor sat alone in her drawing-room with cold tea and the carriage visible through her window, and she felt the last fragile hope she had been nursing wither into dust, because the interpretation fit too perfectly with everything she knew about her own unremarkable nature and the vast distance between her circumstances and Christopher's world of wealth and consequence. April 23rd arrived with morning light that felt harsh and unforgiving as Eleanor woke from another restless night to see the black carriage still stationed outside her window. And the sight of it filled her not with confusion or wounded curiosity, but with a weary determination to reclaim whatever dignity remained to a spinster of 29 whose reputation was being systematically destroyed by a man who had already declared her unworthy of his love. She rose and dressed in a simple brown morning dress that seemed to match her mood, and when Sarah brought tea, Eleanor informed the maid with a steadiness that surprised them both that she would be leaving London to visit Margaret's country estate in Hertfordshire. And Sarah's face showed relief, because the girl had watched her mistress grow thinner and more shadowed over the past 11 days since the assembly. Eleanor moved through the morning with mechanical efficiency, pulling her modest trunk from the storage closet and beginning to pack the limited wardrobe that represented her entire claim to respectability, each folded dress and carefully wrapped pair of shoes a small symbol of retreat from a battle she had never asked to fight. She sat at her writing desk near the window where the carriage was visible like an accusation in the spring sunlight, and she drew out a single sheet of paper and stared at it for long minutes before dipping her pen in ink with a hand that trembled only slightly. The letter she composed was brief and formal, requesting with as much dignity as she could summon that Lord Christopher Thornhill cease his vigil outside her residence, as his continued presence was damaging her reputation and causing her considerable distress, and she signed it with her full name rather than any attempt at familiarity, because there was no relationship between them except the one that existed in her foolish imagination. She folded the letter and sealed it with plain wax because her family had no crest, and the reduced circumstances of the Pembroke household meant such luxuries had long been sold to pay her late father's debts. And she called Sarah and pressed the letter into the maid's hand with instructions to deliver it directly to the gentleman in the carriage across the street. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window and watched as Sarah crossed the narrow street and knocked on the carriage door, watched as it opened and Christopher's face appeared, watched as he took the letter with an expression she could not read from this distance, but which seemed to involve a sudden stillness that gripped his entire frame. He broke the seal and read the brief contents while Sarah waited, and Eleanor saw his head bow as though the words had physical weight, saw his hand clench on the paper, saw him look up toward her window, though she stepped back quickly so he could not see her watching him. Sarah returned with no message because Eleanor had not requested a reply, and Eleanor turned away from the window and resumed her packing with movements that felt both necessary and utterly hollow, telling herself that leaving London was the only sensible course for a woman who had allowed herself to become entangled in whatever game or cruelty Christopher Thornhill was playing. April 23rd arrived with evening shadows that brought candlelight to the drawing-room, where Eleanor stood beside her now packed trunk, exhausted from a day spent preparing for flight, and believing that the letter she had sent would finally end the strange torment that had consumed 11 days of her life, and she had changed into a simple dove-grey evening dress, because even in retreat she maintained the habits of propriety that were all a spinster of modest means possessed in the way of armour against a world that had long dismissed her as unremarkable. Sarah was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Davies prepare a cold supper when the knock came at the door, firm and decisive in a way that made Eleanor's heart lurch, because visitors at this hour were uncommon in a household as obscure as hers. And when Sarah appeared moments later with a face that showed equal parts alarm and something that might have been satisfaction, Eleanor knew before the maid spoke that Christopher Thornhill stood in her modest entrance hall requesting an audience. Every instinct told Eleanor to refuse, because she had nothing left to say to a man who had made sport of her dignity. But some deeper current beneath her exhaustion and hurt carried a desperate need to understand, and she heard herself grant permission, with a voice that sounded steadier than the trembling in her hands, as Sarah showed him into the drawing-room, where candlelight revealed the stark contrast between his world and hers. Christopher entered, still wearing day clothes that bore signs of disarray unusual for a man of his station, his cravat slightly loosened and his dark hair showing the marks of fingers run through it in agitation, and his eyes, when they met hers, carried a wildness that made him look almost haunted, nothing like the cold, calculating earl that Lady Harriet had described, or even the guarded man who had rejected her at the assembly. He stood just inside the doorway, as though uncertain of his welcome in this space he had never entered, despite 11 days stationed outside it, and his gaze travelled over the modest furnishings and faded curtains, and finally landed on the packed trunk beside Eleanor with an expression that approached something like panic. She remained standing near the window, with her hands clasped before her in a posture that gave her dignity, if not confidence, and she waited for him to speak, because she had already said everything her letter contained, and she would not beg for explanations from a man who owed her nothing. Christopher took 2 steps further into the room, and the words that emerged were rougher than his usual cultured tones, asking with an urgency that seemed to pain him whether she truly meant to leave London. And when Eleanor confirmed that she departed for her sister's estate in Hertfordshire, the following morning his face showed such raw distress that for a moment she forgot to guard herself against hope. He asked in a voice that had lost all its aristocratic polish why she would go, and Eleanor felt anger rise through her exhaustion because the question seemed willfully blind to the damage his presence had caused, and she replied with more heat than she intended that a woman whose reputation had been destroyed by the inexplicable attention of a gentleman far above her station had little choice but to retreat from a situation that brought her nothing but confusion and pain. April 23rd continued in the drawing-room, where candlelight flickered against walls that seemed to close around them with an intimacy Eleanor had never imagined possible in this space that had witnessed so many lonely evenings, and Christopher's raw distress at her words about reputation and confusion seemed to break something in him, because he crossed the remaining distance between them with 3 long strides, and stopped just beyond proper distance, with his hands clenched at his sides as though restraining himself from reaching for her. He began to speak with words that came in a rush, as though a dam had broken, telling her that he understood her anger and confusion because he had caused both through his own cowardice at the assembly 11 days ago, and Eleanor felt her breath catch, because this was the first acknowledgment he had made that the cruel rejection had indeed occurred and mattered. Christopher turned away toward the window where rain had begun again in a soft patter that echoed the night of the assembly, and his profile showed the tension in his jaw as he explained that he had been pressured by Lady Harriet Sinclair and his mother and half the society matrons in London to publicly dismiss any interest in Eleanor Pembroke, because a man of his station could not be seen to favour a woman of her circumstances and age and lack of social brilliance. The words were brutal in their honesty, and Eleanor felt them like small cuts even as she recognized he was not endorsing these judgments, but reporting them, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to something rougher that revealed genuine pain beneath the explanation. He told her that he had been watched that night, tested by Lady Harriet, who had noticed his attention wandering to Eleanor throughout the evening, and who had manufactured the moment by asking loudly enough for others to hear whether Lord Thornhill found the Pembroke spinster an object of interest, and he had panicked and spoken the lie that he could never love someone so unremarkable, because to admit the truth would have subjected Eleanor to even worse scrutiny and gossip than she had already endured. Eleanor sank into the chair nearest her because her legs would not hold her steady, and she looked up at Christopher with confusion warring against a desperate need to believe, as she asked why he had stationed his carriage outside her home for 11 days, if he truly meant to protect her from gossip. He turned back to face her, and in the candlelight his eyes held a wildness that made him look both vulnerable and fierce as he crossed to where she sat and lowered himself into the chair opposite, maintaining physical distance but leaning forward with an intensity that felt like touch. Christopher said with a voice that shook slightly that he had meant to stay away after the assembly, had ordered his driver to take him home, but found himself unable to leave her street because the lie he had spoken kept echoing in his mind with such force that he could not bear it. And when she asked what lie he meant, he looked directly into her eyes and said the words that would shift everything between them. "I said I could never love you, Eleanor," he told her, using her first name for the very first time and investing it with such tenderness that she felt tears gather hot behind her eyes. "I said I could never love you," he repeated, "and I have never told a more damning lie, because the truth is I had already begun to fall in love with you weeks before that assembly, and every moment since has only deepened what I feel, despite my attempts to deny it and protect us both from the consequences." April 24th arrived with morning light that seemed softer than the days before. Or perhaps it was Eleanor's perception that had shifted after a night spent sleepless, not from grief, but from the replaying of Christopher's words in the drawing-room where he had confessed that his cruel rejection had been a lie, and that he had already begun to fall in love with her weeks before the assembly, and she rose from her bed with a trembling uncertainty about what this confession meant for her future, because years of invisibility had taught her to mistrust moments that seemed too bright to be real. She moved to the window, still wearing her nightdress, with a shawl pulled around her shoulders against the morning chill. And when she looked down to the street below, her heart caught, because the black carriage with the Thornhill crest was still stationed in its now familiar place. But where before it had felt like torment or surveillance, this morning it appeared different, as though the same object had been transformed by context into something that spoke of vigil rather than cruelty, devotion rather than sport. Eleanor stood watching the carriage for long minutes as Sarah brought washing water and helped her dress in a simple morning gown of pale blue, and she noted with some surprise that her hands were steady despite the tumult of her thoughts. And when she descended to the morning room, she found her trunk still packed beside the door, like a rebuke to the hope that was beginning, against all her better judgment, to take root in her chest. She had barely settled with tea when Margaret arrived in a flurry of yellow muslin and genuine concern, having come directly after breakfast because she had lain awake, worrying about Eleanor's planned departure to Hertfordshire, and Margaret's eyes went immediately to the packed trunk, and then to Eleanor's face with a searching look that missed nothing of the change that a single evening had wrought. Eleanor found herself telling her sister everything, in a voice that remained calm, even as the story itself seemed impossible, describing the 11 days of the stationed carriage, and the letter she had sent, and Christopher's arrival last evening, and most importantly, the confession he had made about the rejection being a lie, spoken under pressure, while his true feelings ran in entirely the opposite direction, and Margaret listened with an expression that moved from concern to something that looked almost like satisfaction. When Eleanor finished, Margaret reached across the small table to take her hand, and said something that shifted Eleanor's understanding of her entire history with Christopher Thornhill, revealing that Margaret had attended the same assemblies and gatherings throughout the season and had noticed weeks ago how Christopher's attention seemed to follow Eleanor even when he made no approach, how his gaze would find her across crowded rooms and linger with an intensity that Margaret had recognized as interest, even if Eleanor herself had remained oblivious in her certainty of her own unremarkability. Margaret spoke with gentle conviction about how she had thought it strange when Christopher made his cruel public statement because it contradicted everything his behavior had suggested in the weeks before, and now, hearing Eleanor's account of his confession, Margaret said it all made terrible sense as the action of a man caught between genuine feeling and social expectation, who had chosen poorly in the moment, but whose heart had refused to accept the choice. Eleanor felt tears gather as she listened to her sister reframe every interaction she had dismissed as coincidence or imagination, and she began tentatively to reconsider the brief moments when she had caught Christopher watching her at gatherings, the times their paths had crossed in ways she had attributed to chance, and wondered, with a painful hope, whether she had been beaten all along by the one person whose notice she had never dared to seek. April 25th arrived with afternoon sunlight that transformed Eleanor's modest drawing room into something warmer than she remembered it ever being, and when Sarah announced Lord Thornhill with a formality that barely concealed her excitement, Eleanor rose from her seat with hands that trembled despite her efforts at composure, because this would be the first time Christopher called upon her with proper intention rather than desperate confession, and the difference felt monumental in ways she was still learning to comprehend. He entered carrying wild roses gathered in a simple bunch without the artifice of hothouse arrangement, and the gesture struck her as so perfectly considered that she felt tears threaten, because these were not the showy blooms a man brought to impress society, but rather the unpretentious flowers one offered to someone whose true nature one had actually observed and valued. Christopher was dressed in formal afternoon calling attire of dark blue superfine and buff breeches that emphasized both his station and the care he had taken with this visit, and Eleanor became suddenly aware of her own appearance in her best afternoon dress of soft rose muslin that was still modest and unfashionable, but represented the finest garment she possessed, and she saw in his eyes as they met hers that he found her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with society's measures, and everything to do with sight that went deeper than surface. He crossed the room with the roses extended, and when she took them, their fingers brushed in a contact that lasted only seconds, but seemed to carry the weight of all the days his carriage had stationed outside in vigil. And he asked with a formality that barely contained deeper emotion whether she would accept these poor offerings as a token of his esteem and regard. Eleanor found a simple glass vase that had belonged to her mother, and arranged the roses with hands that had steadied now that he was actually present rather than anticipated, and she was aware of Christopher watching her movements with an attention that made ordinary actions feel significant. And when she placed the vase on the small table near the window, where afternoon light would touch the petals, he said, "They looked perfect," there in a voice that suggested he meant something beyond flowers and vases. They sat in the chairs that had held them 2 evenings before during his confession, but the quality of the space between them had shifted from desperate revelation to tentative beginning, and Christopher leaned forward with his hands clasped loosely between his knees as he asked whether she had considered what he told her about his feelings, and whether she might be willing to allow him the honor of courting her properly, despite the difficult beginning they had endured. Eleanor looked at this man who had wounded her with public rejection and then refused to leave her street, who had confessed lies and truths in equal measure, and she recognized that her answer would determine not just the arc of a courtship, but the entire shape of her future, whether she would choose the safety of low expectations or the terrifying vulnerability of hope. She told him with a voice that shook only slightly that she would agree to let him court her, but that he must understand she would need time to learn to trust what his actions showed when his earlier words had cut so deep, and she watched relief and determination cross his features as he promised he would earn her trust through every means available to him for however long it required. Christopher admitted then that the carriage vigil had been all he could allow himself when he had no right to approach her directly, that sitting outside her home had felt like the only way to remain connected to her while he wrestled with duty and desire and tried to find courage to defy the expectations that had driven his cruel public statement. And hearing him name his cowardice and his struggle made him somehow more real and therefore more trustworthy than easy charm would have accomplished. April 28th arrived with the warmth of late spring, beginning to assert itself over London's cool mornings, and the 3 days since Christopher had begun formally courting Eleanor had transformed her existence in ways both exhilarating and terrifying, as she discovered what it meant to be genuinely seen by another person who valued her for qualities she had stopped believing held worth. The first walk they took together through Hyde Park during the fashionable afternoon hour represented Eleanor's debut as a woman being courted rather than a spinster fading into irrelevance, and she wore a new walking dress of soft green muslin that Margaret had insisted on purchasing for her over her protests about expense, and though the dress was modest by society standards, it fit properly and flattered her thin frame in a way her older garments never had. And she felt Christopher's pride as he offered his arm and guided her along the paths where the fashionable crowds paraded their connections and alliances. Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed their progress, of Lady Harriet Sinclair's shocked expression when their paths crossed near the Serpentine, of the way conversations seemed to halt and then resume with increased intensity after they passed. But Christopher appeared entirely unconcerned with the social commentary their pairing generated, and instead spoke to her about his estate in Derbyshire with an enthusiasm that revealed his deep connection to the land and the people who lived on it, describing the tenant families and the improvements he hoped to implement, and asking her opinions on education programs for the village children in a way that suggested he genuinely valued her thoughts, rather than merely performing courtship rituals. On their second outing, he brought her a volume of poetry by Wordsworth, with several passages marked where he thought she might find particular resonance, and they spent an afternoon in her small drawing room discussing the relationship between nature and human emotion, while Sarah served tea and tried unsuccessfully to hide her delight at seeing her mistress engaged in intellectual discourse with a gentleman who listened as much as he spoke, and Eleanor discovered that Christopher had read widely and thought deeply about subjects far beyond estate management and social obligation, and that he seemed to take genuine pleasure in the exchange of ideas with her in a way that made her feel intellectually valued for perhaps the first time since her father's death 5 years earlier. Christopher loaned her 3 more books over the following days, including a volume on agricultural innovation and a novel by an author she had never encountered, and each selection seemed carefully chosen to both interest her and reveal something of his own concerns and passions, building between them a connection that existed in layers beyond the surface attraction that society deemed the only legitimate foundation for courtship. Yet even as Eleanor bloomed under this unprecedented attention, the social backlash intensified in proportion to their growing closeness, and she began to notice how Lady Harriet Sinclair seemed to be everywhere they went in public, watching with an expression of calculating displeasure that suggested active opposition rather than mere disapproval. And Margaret reported that rumors were circulating about Eleanor having somehow trapped or deceived Christopher into attention he would surely regret once he came to his senses, and that Lady Beatrice Ashford's family was reportedly furious at Christopher's defection from what they had considered an all but settled understanding. And Thomas Langley stopped by one afternoon to warn Eleanor in his gruff but well-meaning way that she was stirring powerful forces that might harm her reputation beyond repair if Christopher's interest proved temporary, or if his family succeeded in pressuring him back into more suitable arrangements. May 2nd arrived with evening shadows stretching across Eleanor's drawing room as Sarah announced a visitor with unusual formality that carried a note of warning, and when the Dowager Countess of Thornhill entered the modest space, Eleanor understood immediately that this was no social courtesy, but rather a calculated strike designed to sever the connection that had been growing between herself and Christopher over the past week of cautious courtship. And she rose from her chair with hands that wanted to tremble, but that she forced into steadiness because she would not grant this formidable woman the satisfaction of seeing her cower before wealth and title that had nothing to do with actual worth. The dowager was dressed in elaborate black silk, trimmed with silver thread that caught the candlelight and seemed designed to emphasize both her mourning status and her superiority. And her assessment of Eleanor's drawing room was swift and comprehensive, taking in the modest furnishings and faded curtains and simple tea service with an expression that communicated disdain more effectively than words could have accomplished. And Eleanor felt her home's inadequacies, as she had not felt them even during Lady Harriet's earlier visit, because this woman held direct power over Christopher's future and therefore over the fragile hope that Eleanor had been trying so carefully to protect from her own pessimism and society's judgment. The dowager accepted tea with the air of one performing an unpleasant duty and wasted no time on preliminary courtesies before explaining in a voice that mixed maternal concern with aristocratic command that Christopher had responsibilities to his name and position that superseded personal inclination, that the Thornhill line had maintained its prominence through careful alliance and strategic marriage for 8 generations, and that Eleanor must surely understand that her background and circumstances made her entirely unsuitable as a partner for a man of Christopher's standing, regardless of whatever temporary fascination he might currently imagine he felt. Eleanor listened with her teacup balanced in hands that had gone cold despite the warm porcelain, because hearing Christopher's feelings dismissed as temporary fascination struck at every doubt she had been harboring beneath her cautious willingness to accept his courtship, and the dowager continued with the relentlessness of someone who believed absolutely in the rightness of her position, explaining that Lady Beatrice Ashford represented exactly the sort of alliance the family required, that her substantial dowry and impeccable lineage would strengthen the Thornhill holdings and influence in ways that mattered for future generations, and that Eleanor's acceptance of Christopher's attention when she must know herself to be inappropriate was therefore an act of selfishness that prioritized her own desires over his welfare and duty. The words landed with precision on every vulnerable place in Eleanor's heart, because she had spent 29 years being told in countless subtle and explicit ways that she was insufficient, and now this woman who commanded social power, Eleanor could never hope to approach, was confirming that Christopher's interest could not possibly endure against the weight of obligation and family expectation, and the dowager delivered her final strike with devastating gentleness by suggesting that Christopher might believe he cared now, but that duty always won in the end among men of honor, and that Eleanor would be kinder to release him before his misguided loyalty to a rash declaration caused permanent damage to his standing and future. When the dowager departed after this brief, brutal visit, Eleanor remained motionless in her chair and noticed with detached observation that the wild roses Christopher had brought a week earlier had begun to wilt in their simple vase, their petals browning at the edges in a way that seemed symbolically appropriate, and she recognized that, despite Christopher's passionate declarations and consistent presence, she had never truly believed she deserved the happiness he offered, and that the dowager had simply voiced the doubts Eleanor had been carrying silently beneath every moment of courtship, the certainty that eventually he would recognize his mistake and return to the world where he properly belonged, while she resumed her expected invisibility. May 4th arrived with afternoon sunlight casting gentle warmth across Eleanor's small back garden, where spring flowers had begun their earnest blooming in defiance of the modest circumstances that limited everything else about her household, and she had asked Christopher to meet her here rather than in the drawing room because she needed the illusion of space and air for what she intended to say. And when he arrived with that expression of concerned attentiveness that had become familiar over their days of courtship, she felt her resolve waver even as she forced herself to speak the words she had been rehearsing since the Dowager's devastating visit to evenings prior. She told him with hands clasped tightly before her that they should stop seeing each other, that she had been selfish and foolish to accept his courtship when she understood perfectly well that his position required a different sort of wife than she could ever be, and that she was releasing him from whatever sense of obligation or temporary affection had bound him to declarations he would surely come to regret once the initial fascination faded and duty reasserted its proper claims. And she delivered this speech while staring at the Canterbury bells blooming near the garden wall because she could not bear to see relief, or worse yet pity in his face, when she gave him the escape his family so desperately wished him to take. Christopher was silent for a long moment that stretched unbearably between them before he stepped closer and said in a voice that carried an edge she had never heard from him that he would not accept her withdrawal, that she was not releasing him from anything, because he had entered into courtship with full awareness of his choices and their consequences, and that if she wished to end things between them, she would need to provide a reason that had nothing to do with his mother's opinions or society's expectations or her own mistaken belief that she was somehow doing him a favor by disappearing back into the invisibility she had occupied before he had been fool enough to speak cruel lies at an assembly 22 days ago. Eleanor finally looked at him, then, and saw not relief, but something very near anger in his expression. A passion that seemed barely restrained as he continued speaking, and told her that her worth had nothing whatsoever to do with the measures society applied to judge women as though they were horses at auction, that he had spent the past weeks discovering a mind and spirit, and essential goodness that made every eligible debutante he had ever been pressured to court seem like hollow performances of femininity without substance, and that she was not insufficient, but rather that the world was too limited in its vision to recognize what actually mattered in a human soul. They were standing very close now in the small garden with the scent of flowers and warming earth around them, closer than propriety strictly allowed, and Eleanor could see the fine lines near his eyes and the exact color of gray in his gaze and the tension in his jaw that suggested he was holding himself back from some action that hovered just beyond execution, and she felt something shifting inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. Christopher raised his hand as though to touch her face, and then stopped himself, and his voice dropped lower as he said that he understood she was frightened, because he had given her every reason to doubt his constancy with his initial cruelty, but that he was asking her to trust that he knew his own heart and his own mind, and that neither his mother nor society nor duty itself would alter what he had chosen. And the word chosen carried a weight that seemed to encompass more than just courtship or marriage, but rather a fundamental decision about what sort of man he intended to be, and what sort of life held meaning worth pursuing. May 7th arrived with the sort of pale morning light that held the tentative quality of spring not yet settled into certainty, and Eleanor had passed the night in a state somewhere between waking and dreaming, where Christopher's words from the garden repeated endlessly against the counter-argument her doubts provided with relentless efficiency, and when Sarah announced at an hour far too early for proper calling that Lord Thornhill requested her presence with an urgency that seemed to override all consideration of social propriety. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest that might have been alarm or anticipation, or perhaps both emotions tangled together past the point of separation. She dressed hastily with Sarah's efficient assistance and came downstairs to find Christopher waiting in her small entrance hall, looking as though he had not slept either, and there was a determination in his expression that made her understand without words being spoken that something significant was about to occur. Some crossing of a threshold that once traversed could not be reversed. And when he asked her to come with him somewhere that he could not yet explain, but that required her trust, she found herself agreeing, despite every reasonable objection her practical mind attempted to raise against the impropriety and strangeness of the request. The carriage that had become such a fixture outside her home now carried them through London streets, just beginning to wake to morning commerce. And Christopher remained silent during the drive, with a tension that suggested he was rehearsing words or steeling himself for revelation, and Eleanor sat across from him in the intimate space that smelled of leather and his particular scent of sandalwood and something indefinably him, and tried not to let hope or fear overwhelm the fragile composure she had managed to construct. They arrived at a small church tucked between larger buildings in a neighborhood that held quiet dignity without grandeur, and Christopher handed her down from the carriage with a touch that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary before leading her through the heavy wooden door into a space where morning light filtered through stained glass to paint the worn stone floor in colors that seemed to hold their own gentle benediction, and the silence inside felt sacred in a way that had nothing to do with religious observance, and everything to do with the weight of human lives and choices and the moments that defined what sort of people we became. Christopher led her to the side wall where memorial plaques commemorated generations of Thornhill family dead, and he stopped before one particular inscription that honored his father with the dates of his life rendered in simple bronze, and Eleanor read the words, carved beneath the name that spoke of a man who had chosen love over expectation, and had never once regretted the decision that cost him his family's approval, and she understood with sudden clarity that Christopher was showing her not just his father's memorial, but rather the inheritance that mattered more than title or wealth or social position. Christopher's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a roughness that suggested emotion held barely in check as he explained that his father had married a vicar's daughter against the wishes of everyone who claimed authority over his future, that the dowager had never forgiven her husband for that choice, even though the marriage had been by all accounts profoundly happy until his father's death 6 years prior, and that Christopher had spent those years since trying to be the son his mother demanded while slowly suffocating under the weight of duty that seemed to require the sacrifice of everything that made life worth living. And then he turned to face Eleanor, fully in the colored light falling through stained glass, and said with absolute certainty that he was his father's son after all, and that he chose her with full understanding of the cost and no illusion about the battle ahead, and complete willingness to pay whatever price his choice required. May 6th continued into afternoon as the carriage carried them back through London streets that seemed somehow altered by what had occurred in the church, as though the city itself had been witness to Christopher's declaration and rearranged itself accordingly around the shape of this new reality they were constructing together. And when they arrived at Eleanor's modest townhouse, she felt a strange disorientation, seeing the familiar brick facade and simple door through eyes that had shifted their understanding of what future might lie beyond the narrow confines she had accepted as the immutable boundaries of her existence. Christopher handed her down from the carriage with a touch that seemed to convey both question and promise, and instead of departing as propriety would dictate after such an extended and unchaperoned excursion, he followed her to the door, and when Sarah opened it with an expression of mingled curiosity and concern, he asked in a voice that carried formal weight whether he might speak with Miss Pembroke on a matter of some importance, and Eleanor felt her heart accelerate to a rhythm that seemed too rapid for her body to contain as she understood with sudden clarity what manner of conversation he intended to initiate. They moved to the drawing-room, where this entire improbable sequence had taken so many turns, the same space where he had first entered her home 13 days prior, looking disheveled and desperate after receiving her letter, and the afternoon light falling through the window illuminated the worn furniture and faded curtains with a gentleness that made even modest circumstances seem touched with grace. And Christopher closed the door despite the impropriety while Sarah and Mrs. Davies hovered in the hallway with an attentiveness that suggested they understood perfectly well what was occurring and had no intention of being far should their mistress require witnesses to joy rather than protection from impropriety. Christopher stood before her in the center of the small room and said with a formality that seemed almost ceremonial that he had no father to ask, and she had no guardian to grant permission, and therefore he was addressing himself directly to her as the only person whose consent actually mattered in a decision that would shape the remainder of his life. And then he lowered himself to one knee on her threadbare carpet with a grace that made the gesture seem neither awkward nor performative, but rather exactly right. And Eleanor felt tears begin to blur her vision as he reached into his coat and produced a ring that caught the afternoon light in small green fire. The ring was neither grand nor fashionable, a simple emerald surrounded by seed pearls in a setting that spoke of an earlier era when ostentation mattered less than the quiet beauty of restrained elegance. And Christopher explained as he held it that the ring had belonged to his father's mother rather than to the dowager's family line, that it had been given to a woman who married for love rather than position and had worn it for 40 years of profoundly happy marriage, and that he could think of no more appropriate symbol for what he wished to offer Eleanor if she would consent to accept both the ring and the man who came with it. Christopher's voice steadied as he began to speak not of general devotion, but of specific qualities, telling her that he loved the way her mind engaged with ideas in the books they had discussed, the particular tilt of her head when she was considering an argument, the quiet dignity with which she moved through a world that had failed to recognize her value, the kindness she showed to Sarah and Mrs. Davies that spoke of character rather than performance, the courage it had required to confront him at his carriage in evening twilight 18 days prior, and the essential goodness that made her the only woman he had ever met whom he wished to know more deeply with each passing day rather than less. And Eleanor found she was weeping in earnest now as he asked her with complete sincerity whether she would consent to become his wife and allow him to spend the remainder of his life proving himself worthy of the gift her acceptance would represent. And she managed through tears to speak the single word yes that seemed insufficient to convey the transformation occurring in her chest, where hope and joy and disbelief tangled together into something that felt dangerously close to complete happiness. May 20th arrived with the warmth of late spring fully settled into the city, and with it the afternoon of Eleanor and Christopher's wedding at the same small church where he had shown her his father's memorial and spoken the words that had finally broken through the walls she had built around the possibility of being loved. And Eleanor stood in her modest bedroom while Sarah helped her into a wedding gown of cream silk that Margaret had insisted on commissioning, despite Eleanor's protests about extravagance, and the dress was neither grand nor fashionable by current standards, but rather held a timeless simplicity that suited Eleanor's frame and made her look not like someone trying to be other than she was, but rather like the truest version of herself, rendered visible through fabric that moved like water and caught the afternoon light with quiet radiance. The emerald ring Christopher had placed on her finger 14 days prior rested now on her right hand, as Sarah explained was proper until the ceremony, when it would be joined by the wedding band, and Eleanor found herself turning it absently as she had done countless times since accepting it, still occasionally struck by the unreality of how completely her life had transformed in the span of 38 days from that terrible evening at the assembly when she had believed herself publicly dismissed from even the periphery of romantic possibility. And yet here she stood, preparing to become a countess, and more importantly, preparing to become Christopher's wife with all the intimacy and partnership that the word implied. Margaret arrived in a rustle of rose-colored silk to announce that the carriage was ready, and that Christopher was already at the church looking as nervous as she had ever seen a man, which Margaret delivered with such obvious delight that Eleanor found herself laughing despite the fluttering anxiety in her own chest. And Margaret's expression softened as she took Eleanor's hands and said with absolute sincerity that their father would have been proud beyond measure to see Eleanor marry not just well in society's terms, but truly well in the only measure that mattered. And Eleanor felt tears threaten before Sarah sternly announced that there would be no crying until after the ceremony, unless Eleanor wished to arrive at the church with reddened eyes and a blotched complexion. The small church held perhaps 40 guests, which was all either Eleanor or Christopher had wanted, despite the dowager's protests about what was owed to the family name. And as Eleanor walked down the short aisle on Thomas Langley's arm, since he had been her father's closest friend, and had stood by her even when warning her against hope, she saw Christopher turn to watch her approach with an expression that held such unguarded joy and wonder that she understood with absolute certainty that whatever battles lay ahead with society or family, or the simple difficulties of two lives joining into one shared existence, they would face them together with the strength that came from being genuinely seen and valued and chosen. And when she reached the altar, and Christopher took her hand in his with a grip that trembled slightly, she felt the final remnants of the invisible woman she had believed herself to be dissolve completely into the reality of who she actually was and always had been, someone worthy of love, not despite her plainness or age or modest circumstances, but rather worthy simply because she existed as herself, with all her particular qualities that Christopher had catalogued so specifically during his proposal. And as the vicar began the ceremony, Eleanor met Christopher's eyes and saw reflected there the same profound gratitude she felt, that they had both found the courage to defy the voices that told them duty or propriety or social expectation mattered more than the rare and precious thing they had discovered in each other during those strange days when his carriage had stationed itself outside her home like a silent declaration. His words had not yet learned to speak, and the wedding breakfast held at Margaret's considerably larger townhouse unfolded with a warmth that had nothing to do with the number of guests or the elaborateness of the arrangements, but rather emanated from the genuine joy that seemed to have infected even those who had initially disapproved of the match. And Eleanor found herself seated beside Christopher at a table laden with food she could barely taste, through the persistent sense of unreality that accompanied the knowledge that she was now legally and spiritually bound to the man whose carriage had haunted her street for those strange days in April, when she had not yet understood that sometimes love announces itself through presence rather than words. Lady Harriet Sinclair had declined the invitation with a tersely worded note that fooled no one about her displeasure. But Thomas Langley stood to offer a toast that surprised Eleanor with its emotional sincerity, as he spoke of having watched Eleanor navigate years of social invisibility with a dignity that had impressed him even when he had doubted the wisdom of encouraging her hopes with regard to Christopher. And he said now, with his voice carrying across the assembled guests, that he had never been more pleased to have been proven wrong about the likely outcome of any situation in his entire life. And Eleanor felt Christopher's hand find hers beneath the table and squeeze gently in acknowledgement of how much Thomas's approval meant, given his connection to her father. The Dowager Countess had attended the wedding with a stiff formality that suggested she was performing a duty rather than celebrating a joy. But during the breakfast, Eleanor noticed her in conversation with Margaret, and saw something in the older woman's expression soften slightly, as Margaret no doubt employed her considerable charm in defence of her sister, And while Eleanor harbored no illusions that she and her new mother-in-law would quickly develop warmth, she allowed herself to hope that time and Christopher's obvious happiness might eventually erode the worst of the dowager's resistance to a match she had not chosen or approved. Sarah and Mrs. Davies had been given places at one of the tables in recognition of their years of loyal service and their role in sustaining Eleanor through the difficult period when Christopher's carriage had been both torment and mystery. And Eleanor caught Sarah's eye across the room and received in return a smile of such pure satisfaction that she understood her maid considered this outcome a personal victory in which she had played no small part through her steady encouragement and refusal to let Eleanor sink into complete despair during those confusing days. As the afternoon lengthened toward evening, and guests began to depart with wishes for happiness and health, Christopher leaned close to Eleanor and murmured that the carriage was prepared to take them to his estate, in the country where they would spend the next month away from London and all its complicated social dynamic. And Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness at what the coming night would bring, mixed with a deeper sense of rightness that she was embarking on this new phase of existence with a man who had proven himself willing to defy expectation and endure discomfort for the sake of claiming her as his wife. They departed Margaret's house near sunset with rice falling around them like blessings and climbed into the familiar black carriage with the Thornhill crest that had become such a fixture outside Eleanor's modest home, and as the vehicle pulled away from the celebration and turned toward the road that would carry them out of the city, Christopher gathered Eleanor against his side in a way that would have been scandalous mere weeks ago, but was now perfectly proper given their changed status. And she rested her head against his shoulder and felt the steady rhythm of his breathing and thought about how 38 days could contain enough transformation to reshape an entire life from resigned spinsterhood to married love. And as London fell away behind them, and the spring countryside opened before them in the gathering dusk, Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself to simply feel the profound gratitude and cautious joy of a woman who had been told she would never be chosen, but had somehow found herself not just chosen, but treasured by a man whose early words had been lies, but whose silent carriage vigil had spoken a truth his voice had not yet learned to say.